And I think part of it is structural in the sense of what happens to an imperial court centric ruling class and ruling system. And part of it is the loss of insight that goes along with that process of becoming, a navel-gazing courtier class. And in America, ever since the Clinton administration, but including all those that came after, with the possible exception of Mr. Trump, has seen the rise of a global elite, championing words like globalization, gathering by the hundreds in their private jets at Davos every January, and increasingly separate and cut off from the pulse of the actual nation of the American people.
Well, of course, this was exactly Corelli Barnett's argument.
Yes.
That the British ruling classes had this vision of England, primarily, that didn't exist anymore, that had vanished as a result of the First World War. And we have a similar situation right now. If you ask the ruling elites here about America, they wax eloquently about America. Well, have you visited it lately? I talked to someone the other day who insisted that, this inflation isn't all that bad and we can master this and get by. And I said, drive 100 miles west, 100 miles north, or 100 miles south of Washington, D.C., and go to the food banks and look at the lines of people in the food banks waiting to be fed. I said, things are not good. But this same sort of disconnect is there. But we, unlike Great Britain, don't have the United States that's going to march in and supplant what we don't have with their capabilities.
Well, this is a powerful aspect about this ruling class and this ruling class ethos of globalization. Is that on one hand, again, since Clinton all the way up to 2016 at the very least, and then again after 2020, there has been this almost conscious deindustrialization of the U.S. In other words, during those administrations, the U.S. actively allowed 50% of our manufacturing base to move to China. Some of it to Mexico, but it changed the balance in the global economy. And they don't care about borders. In fact, they want more cheap labor in the U.S. And they have a ruling ethos that is not really connected to the preceding ethos, which was the American ethos, which was a more unitary, if hardly monolithic, but more unitary concept of the nation. They don't have a concept of the nation. They have a concept of a world elite class. And what that does is it puts them and their worldview in a context where they use the word identity as a political cudgel. And identity to them is just another tactic in their attempt to seize and control power. Actual identity, as in the old nation, is something that exists in Russia, and it's extremely powerful. But they have lost the capacity to understand the existence of that identity. They can only see it as something to be expunged somehow.
Well, the sad part is our European contemporaries, our colleagues in all of those governments have gleefully participated in the systematic deindustrialization of their societies and the destruction of national identity.
Except for Hungary.
Yeah, with the exception of Hungary. And I would say also with the exception, interestingly enough, of the Poles.
Oh, yeah.
But the thing, though, is that, and dare I mention his name, who is normally viewed as the Antichrist inside the Beltway, and that's Donald Trump, who made the argument that the Europeans had to become their own first responders. It's a very simple statement. But being your own first responder automatically translates into some degree of sovereignty, independence, judgment, thought, strategy, all of which have been swept away through 50, 60 years of NATO.
Well, the humorist might say that Mr. Trump was offering effectively tough love and essentially saying, you don't want to be a vassal? Here's what you have to do. You want to be your own actual nation? Here's what you have to do.
But there's also another part of this vision that's very important, and that is that we see the world as this multipolar place.
Yeah.
And that's not an unhealthy thing.
No.
And increasingly we see regions emerging, regional structures, regional organizations, which is something Hedley Bull predicted many years ago in the 70s and the 60s. You can view that as positive, or you can see it as negative. Now, if you're an imperialist, you live in Versailles on the Potomac, oh, that's terrible, because that means you no longer have control.
Yes.
And ultimately, it's our control which is the issue in this war with Russia.
Yeah, and we've paradoxically undone our control. The last levers we have are financial.
Yes.
And we've even undone and dismissed in the last couple of years energy,
yes.
which is a very powerful lever.
Yes.
And we've let the military slide even in the last 2 years as well. Even the most ready and most revered, sacred weapon in our quiver, we have let it rust.
Well, to some extent, one wonders if we're not similar to the Prussian army on its way to Jena, Auerstedt.
Oh yeah, and it couldn't conceive of itself being not the best.
They sort of maintained this relic as a tribute to the great achievements of Frederick the Great in the 7 Years' War. Didn't turn out to be very effective when it encountered the Grand Army under Napoleon, and I think that we fall into that category so much, which leads us to how do we engage in a sobering self-assessment?
Well, if I could introduce the final chink, or the final piece that has come out as a chink in our situation, and that is that this this blue globalist elite, for want of a better descriptive term, has become itself dependent on its anger and hatred of Russia. And I think in large part this is a case of being hoist to your own petard. The last thing we needed to do is get into a war with Russia. And yet somehow the political ploys that we've been talking about, that you mentioned, of re-ensnaring NATO, restitching their vassal status by using Russia, at some point got out of hand. You could say it was 2014 after. It still sort of hasn't tipped over. But I think what we saw in 2016 with the emergence of this mythology of the Russian bacterium, that it was infecting our body politic, and it was evil, with metaphorical examples like the infection that are similar to what we did with the communists, also to the Nazis. What it created a kind of emotional imbalance. You might even want to sort of compare it to a psychosis, in which our judgment has been degraded.
Oh, absolutely.
Our strategic judgment. So when you ask the question of why don't we step back and see things as they really are, and reassess our situation and take remedial steps, we're admired in our own emotion. I say this because I listen to all of these people in Congress, the writers, the people in the mainstream media, and they really believe what they're saying. So this, to me, might help to explain why the elite has created this fantasy about the war and stuck so doggedly to it, and attacked so relentlessly anyone who tried to bring up a criticism or different analysis.
Well, there's no doubt that this war, on an ideological level, is inextricably intertwined with all of the other misconstrued ideas and confused mindsets that you're mentioning. I don't know that there's an easy solution, but something's going to happen in the near future. This is going to collapse. This narrative is going to fail. It's just like all these supposed Russian atrocities. And many of us have looked at these accusations and allegations and found wanting. They just don't hold up. On the other hand, the Ukrainian forces have done some very terrible things.
Not just regular Ukrainians to other Ukrainians.
Yes. I mean,
the last 8 years.
Yeah, and so this is all going to collapse. And the question is, when it collapses, will we be able to do what you just described, step back? Now, there's one thing working in our favor, and that is that more and more Americans are saying, you want to march into Ukraine with 40,000 troops, and 30,000 Polish troops, and 20,000 Romanian troops? What's wrong with our borders? Why don't we protect our borders? What are we doing for our own national security? This is a legitimate question, and it's beginning to come up more and more. People are not happy with the situation.
Well, in our conversation, I think we've come to an interesting discovery. That is that if you have a courtier class that is in control at this point of the Imperial Court and is giving orders to the American military that run the risk of a further escalation out of proxy war into direct actual war, then this is, as it were, the kind of hinge of fate that we have to face. And in many ways, it suggests that military leaders at some point will have to say no for us not to get into a dangerous situation. And I think there have been some tiny hints of that with Milley.
Well, my classmate, Ray Odierno, who
Yeah.
passed away not long ago, when he was chief of staff, she said, I hear people telling us to do more with less. He said, why can't we do less with less? And it's a legitimate question, and that was about as far as he was willing to go. I wish he'd gone further, but it's true. And it's back to covenants without swords. We have a shrinking military establishment. We have a military establishment right now, which for a whole range of reasons, a lot of people don't want to serve in. And then we have 30 years of senior officer selection that have led to a group of senior leaders
Yes.
that, frankly, most of us on any normal day would not follow, even out of idle curiosity.
I know.
They don't have any gut-wrenching experiences in their background. They don't exhibit professional depth.
I've taught many of them.
Yeah,
Yes.
well, then it's partially your fault, I guess.
Oh yeah. Oh sure.
My point is that we seem to have preferred people that were anxious to go along. Oh yes, of course, if that's what you want, that's your new policy. We'll support it, whatever it is. Just promote me.
The key, and the reason I'm responding here is that apart from my culpability, there is a larger culpability in the military education system which reflects a sclerosis of thinking. In the 186-page syllabus of the strategy and policy course at the Naval War College, the word critical thinking was used 100 times. And yet, all you had to do to ace that course was just get all of the correct answers that were in the 186 pages. And it was effectively a formula, just as all of the little stratagems, I won't call it strategy because it's been stratagems, like counterinsurgency, have been formula. And the formula doesn't work because it's self-serving and self-satisfying. And it strikes me that when this big offensive occurs, so let's tie this to the military picture that we addressed in the first part, and Americans have been so misled, and the fantasy, the souffle of heady aromas that have infused the elite will suddenly collapse. And at that point, there will be those who want to dramatically escalate, like the neocons, and like the most neoliberal blues and blue courtiers. And so that will, I think, be the moment of greatest danger in this entire war. And that'll be the moment when the military leadership's going to have to step up. The problem is, bringing in military education again, is that the entire point in the War College course that I taught all those years was to accommodate and appease civilian leadership in return for autonomy and control and money to preserve your lifestyle.
Yes.
That's not a healthy relationship when you're on the cusp of World War III.
No, I think so. And I served in the War Plans Division of the Army Staff, and one of the things that I could never find was a clear statement of U.S. vital strategic interests.
Right.
Which one would look for as the justification for force structure, contingency planning, and so forth. Instead, you had these vague things. Well, we may have to fight 2 near simultaneous conflicts. And then we might have to fight one and then something else, maybe.
A lesser contingent.
And on and on and on. But there was no, these are the things important. Go back to World War II, and I think this has been a problem for us for a long time. If you go back to General Marshall and his meetings with the British that begin actually before the war is declared privately, but then during the war, these conferences in Morocco and Tehran and so forth, we would walk in and there would be 12 officers or 10 officers with Marshall, and the British would walk in and all of their officers were carrying map cases and books of papers and things. And the British would roll out these maps and show where every oil field was located, where every port was located, where every rail line. We had nothing. And so they say, well, what are you doing? We're defeating Germany. We're defeating Japan. What do you want this to look like when the war's over? What do you want out of this? What do we want the world to look like? I mean, the British were thinking about those things. Of course, they're imperialists. They've been at this for hundreds of years. But we learned almost nothing from this. Well, we're still lost.
If we are chosen by God to be His agent to redeem humanity, why should we look at anyone else? But I think, again, you raise another missing piece here, which is, if you look at World War II, we didn't have, like in the 70s or 80s, a 1.5 war strategy or 2 war strategy. We had a 6 war strategy. We fought at least 6 wars: China, Burma, India, Southwest Pacific, the Navy in the Pacific, the Battle of the Atlantic, the war in Italy, and then the war in the North German plain. And we did it because we had everything. We had limitless everything.
Almost limitless.
Well,
there were still limits. We don't admit to them.
No, but we produced 80,000 combat aircraft in 1944. We gave thousands and thousands of aircraft to the Russians, et cetera, et cetera.
But remember, there was a letter that was sent from Marshall to Eisenhower. And he said, look, you've got all the divisions you're going to get. This is in January, in the midst of the bulge.
90, yeah.
You've got to fight this thing and win it. You're not going to get anything else. We can't do it.
Yeah.
We have all these other commitments, so get on with it and win the war. Well, it was an interesting letter, and
it's powerful.
But it was very important for Eisenhower. And this is something, and I'm not here to discuss whether he was a great president or a bad president. That's another issue entirely. But he did come to the presidency with a very acute sense of just how limited our resources really were and our manpower. And he saw the Second World War through a very different lens from, say, Kennedy or Nixon, who were in the fleet in the Pacific and were starry-eyed and amazed at the masses of ships and everything else. Didn't understand that it all came at a cost.
This is a super point. And the fact that we had, again, using the Clausewitz nugget of, the culminating point of attack. We'd reached the culminating point of attack against Japan.
Yes.
I don't know that we could have pulled off the invasion of Japan or accepted, as a nation, the millions of casualties we would have.
Well, this is your point on Okinawa that is not widely appreciated.
Well, we lost 100,000 casualties on Okinawa and Iwo Jima together. And that's what the Japanese lost. And in other words, they lost fewer. They weren't dead, but to us, it was the casualties that mattered. And the fact is, that was a lesson that Eisenhower absorbed. But generations after him, especially, as you pointed out, the best and the brightest who started VM, they never imbibed that, and even less so, the feckless generations that are now the courtiers at the Imperial Court.
So when you're talking today about the terrible possibility that we might send this coalition of the willing from Poland some distance into Ukraine, which was described by General Petraeus.
Yes.
There is an acute failure to understand what that really means. How many replacements do you have standing behind these forces to replace the wounded? Because you have to assume that the Russians are not going to sit there and ignore the presence of this force in front of them. How many repair parts? How much fuel? How many days of ammunition? We just go down the list. I don't think we've sat down and done the calculus.
Well, this may be the final point of America's strategic weakness and inflexibility, and that is the holy narrative of World War II. And one thing that I'm getting, not just out of the memories of my father's generation talking about the war that were passed on, but also the way in which so much of the rhetoric coming from the blue elite and the mainstream media has tried to recreate the emotional sort of uplift, the emotional high that we had in World War II and afterwards. Almost as though the World War II experience is the thing that we really want to get out of this war, and we thought we could do it on the cheap. And I think one of the reasons the elites rushed to embrace this war is that suddenly the prospect opened up, or rose up, of another ecstatic realization. World War II for the American people was an ecstatic realization. War can do that.
Yes.
War can do the opposite, as we see in World War I.
Yes.
But the ecstatic realization is what the Washington blue courtier elite desperately wanted. They wanted somehow to be the lineal descendants of the people who fought World War II. That is what unnerves me about the coming weeks.
Here's a thought that may end up being a useful sort of conclusion.
Yeah.
Just before we went into Iraq in 2003, and I had a modest role in that by being asked to design an approach that would, at that point in time, get us in and then facilitate a rapid withdrawal.
Right.
Of course, that all changed, but that's another story. But I was watching all the preparations, and there were discussions about these forces are deploying and so forth. And a woman was interviewed in Washington, D.C., who lived in a not very nice neighborhood.
Yeah.
And she said something that has stuck with me ever since. She said, well, I sure wish the U.S. Army would come to my neighborhood and occupy it and get rid of all these drug dealers and criminals.
Wow.
And here we are preparing to move 6,000 miles away to deal with something that in retrospect was, in strategic terms, a pimple.
Yeah.
And at home, what has happened? She was right.
Yeah.
She made an excellent point. And I think that ultimately more and more Americans will come to that conclusion, and it may be the American electorate that rises up and saves us.
Well, the correlation, if you will, between the domestic upheaval and conflict in the U.S. and the fecklessness and yet absolute danger of this imbroglio in Ukraine is, I think, the most salient and urgent issue for Americans to enjoy.
And then I think in the final analysis, what we need to take from all of this is the understanding of this paradigm shift in warfare.
Yeah.
This is the ISR strike connectivity.
Let's get to that then in part 3.
Okay.